What I want to start with first, and we'll bring in our panel to discuss this in a second, is this whole Department of Education thing, and I think a big thing that's been missing from the entire conversation. It has been well documented that the Department of Education, when it was instituted all the way until now, has not, well, led to better outcomes for American students. Now, a lot of the focus has been on the younger students, which totally fine, K through 12, very, very important. What isn't necessarily being talked about a lot is the student loan aspect of the Department of Education. In case you didn't know this, the Department of Education facilitates, handles, and basically issues $1.6 trillion of U.S. student loan debt. That would make it the fifth biggest bank in the United States, which is a huge deal, and again, one that's not necessarily being talked about enough. In 1993, during the Clinton administration, the Department of Education also had a big push into backing student loans with federal money. They took it from private banks and made them federally backed. Okay, well, what did that do? Well, it made colleges go, hold on, the federal government is going to back these student loans? Let's jack up prices and charge these kids as much money as we possibly can, knowing that the feds are going to pay for it if the students can't. And just for the record, Republicans are not entirely absolved of any wrongdoing here. They helped remove the cap recently for the limits on how much money you could take out in grad school, regardless of whether or not your grad program actually benefited the community. Like if you were going to major or get a master's degree in, I don't know, African lesbian dance choreography, well, the federal government took away all of the limits as to how much you could take out to get that useless degree. Now, the student loan in the new process is set to move under the Treasury Department because, well, that would make sense. The people dealing with the money should deal with the money. But at the same time, the Wall Street Journal opinion section said was something that I agree that the Department of Education as it stands should do an audit of where that federally backed student loan money is going and whether or not it's worth the taxpayers' liability. In other words, Linda McMahon, in the process of dismantling the Department of Education, should audit all of the student loans and make sure that U.S. taxpayers aren't on the hook for someone getting a master's degree in underwater basket weaving, hopefully, too, to lessen the cost of higher education in this country. Here to comment on that and a whole bunch more is our awesome panel for the day. Media strategist Gillian Anderson King is here, as well as comedian Kay Vaughn, also here to talk the news of the day. Guys, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks
Thanks
you.
for having me.
Jillian, I want to start with you. So we kind of covered the student loan process thing, but overall, the Department of Education, Trump signed the executive order yesterday. Libs, in lib fashion, lost their minds. I mean, is there a point where we finally get the libs to understand all of these variables in the Department of Education? None of them have turned out well for the American people, for students in the country, and even college students in the country at higher education. It hasn't worked across the board. How do we get that message across to the libs?
I think it's really easy to point out that our country thrived for more than 200 years without a Department of Education. It's really not that old Department of Education really isn't that old. And all we know is that they've wasted over 3 trillion of taxpayer money since its start under Jimmy Carter. They've spent their expenditure has been over 245% of their original cost, but they're not doing anything. We see kids across the nation failing at schools, well below reading and math proficiency. I tutor low-income kids in our neighborhood. They are 3-4 years behind their learning grades, but they are also pushed on them the DEI policies. I witnessed these things firsthand. These are horrible woke agendas that are put on these kids, and they can't even read or write, but they do know they have an F and they have a certain skin color, so that's okay. So I am a huge fan of ripping this apart. It's not beneficial to anybody, and I think the Democrats need to understand at any level, the states are going to know what their schools need, what their people need, what their children need better than anyone.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Kayvon, there's I like to look at things in terms of, well, can I do as bad of a job for less money? And when you look at the Department of Education, it's kind of easy. Is there something that you could do for the federal government and be as bad as the Department of Education and charge the taxpayer even less?
Well, I do know that the left is good at naming things, so they call it the Department of Education. So when Trump goes to cancel it, like, oh, he's against education, but they're not doing a deep dive like you are. So I'm glad you're bringing this up. It's also why they call it the Pride Festival. If you're against Pride, how dare you? But if they called it the Gay LGBT, sex toy festival, people might be against that festival. So it's time that we kind of like not buckle to the pressure just based on the name game. And whatever the left names, they're doing the opposite and they're doing it wrong.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's so often we see bills in Congress entitled "The No Bad Thing Should Happen to Any Good Person Ever," and then when somebody votes against it, like, why do you want bad things to happen to good people? And in reality, the bill sends $1 trillion to, I don't know, some dictator in Africa. It's just ridiculous.